Otago's first real gold rush to the Tuapeka had pushed the tide of diggers much further inland than most pioneer settlers had ever gone before. But it was still just 65 kilometres from Dunedin, and though it involved a couple of days hard walking across hilly country with no real roads, there were no major natural barriers in the way other than the Tuapeka and Waipori rivers. The massive gold strike at the Dunstan in the Cromwell Gorge during the winter of 1862 was a very different story. For a start, no one knew where the heck Dunstan was when the news broke. It soon emerged that it was far inland, 160 kilometres from the coast and across treacherous landscapes broken by steep mountain ranges, deep gorges and swift-flowing rivers, and exposed to harsh changes of weather at any time of the year. Getting there was going to prove an incredible challenge. The route began here on Princes Street, Dunedin's rough main street, by 1862 lined along both sides with places to stay and stores selling all the gear an aspiring gold digger might need. A few also bought pack horses to carry their equipment and provisions, but most had no option but to carry it on their backs as a swag, weighing as much as 35 kilograms. The typical miner would head out of town on one of two routes. The first was south from Princes Street, through Caversham Valley via Lookout Point and on past Green Island, skirting the Taieri Plain to Outram. Alternatively, he might climb the hills behind Dunedin via Dowling or Stewart Streets and take a muddy path through native bush to 3 Mile Hill, then drop down onto the Taieri Plain and follow a track around its northern end to the Taieri River crossing at Outram. A ferry operated here, but it was also pretty easy to wade the river just downstream at most times of the year. Here is where the diggers began climbing and left the bush-clad coastal zone behind. Making their way up over the foothills of the Maunga Atua Range, they ascended hundreds of metres up to the Bearwood Plateau, and then began a 40-kilometre march across this desolate and exposed tussock land towards the Rock and Pillar Range in the far distance. Camp would be made for the first night somewhere near here at Lee's Stream, where primitive shanties soon sprang up to provide the most basic overnight accommodation and some sustenance, though this was often just raw liquor and a canvas roof. Next day, the track took them on to Deep Stream at the foot of the Lammermoor Range, the first and largest of many streams they would need to cross. A small ferry operated here too, as did a couple of hotels, part of a string of shanties along the route, usually situated by its many watercourses. Trudging onwards with wet feet and sodden clothes was a typical experience, but could become deadly as well as uncomfortable when icy winds swept across the plateau, as they might do in any season. From Deep Stream, it was a tough climb up nearly 1,000 metres to another exposed tussock plateau atop the Lammermoor summit. This offered scant shelter, either from the ice and snow of winter southerlies or from the scorching northwest winds of spring and summer. Either way, it was a hard day's slog. The long trek across the plateau skirted a great boggy swamp, now the site of the Logan Burn Reservoir, with the castle-like profile of McPhee's Rock on the northern skyline like a stone beacon guiding the diggers onwards. McPhee's Rock was often the stopping place at the end of day 2. It was about the halfway point, and just beneath it was a wooden hut known as the Halfway House. The third day began with a short walk before reaching the lip of a gorge from which the diggers had panoramic views of the Otago interior. Below them was the scroll plain of the upper Taieri River. Westwards, they could see the serrated profile of the Rough Ridge, and further on, Leaning Rock on the Dunstan Range, another distinctive rock formation that acted like a lighthouse, visible for huge distances across the interior. It would have been a thrilling sight for some, for others awe-inspiring, and even frightening, the beautiful and desolate immensity of inland Otago. But first, they had to make a sharp 500-metre descent to where the Styx Creek met the Upper Taieri River. Here, we can still see these remnants of a cluster of buildings that sprang up at this junction to service the goldfield traffic in 1862. One was a hotel, another a stone lock-up where the gold escort secured its fortnightly load en route down to Dunedin, as well as any prisoners has been transported in the same direction. After crossing the river, they advanced across this rough terrain another 10 kilometres to the next resting point at the foot of Rough Ridge, site of the Black Ball Hotel. This would later be the point at which tracks diverged towards the Serpentine diggings southwards and the Hogburn diggings to the north, but all that lay in the future as the first diggers headed for the Dunstan in late 1862. They now faced a tough 600-metre climb up Rough Ridge with its huge rocky outcrops, interspersed with thick tussock and spiky Spaniards. The climbs just kept getting tougher and the countryside more desolate the further inland the diggers penetrated. It must have been as daunting to the spirit as it was physically grueling. On Rough Ridge, there was a notorious stone shanty at Drunken Woman's Creek. The very name tells the story, I guess, now drowned beneath the Paulburn Reservoir. This was another overnight stopping point for many. From here, they would face a long, gradual climb down into the Ida Valley, heading straight for Leaning Rock and with just one more line of hills to pass, the Raggedies. For the first time since leaving the Taieri, this provided a stretch of easy walking. The last hill climb was not so bad either, and from the top of the Raggedies, the diggers got their first glimpse of their ultimate goal, the Dunstan Range and the Molyneux River, now known as the Clutha, whose gravel beaches had provided Hartley and Riley's great windfall. There was just a final 20-kilometre tramp, and at long last, a week or so and 160 kilometres from Dunedin, the end was in sight. And now all they had to do was find some gold.